artificial intelligence, before hitting the kind of commercial scene, had decades of science fiction that really prepared the consumer to kind of accept the term and get excited about it, right? Whereas kind of blockchain, the first thing about blockchain was, at least I think to an average consumer, and certainly to me, was cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Then the first thing about cryptocurrency was kind of drugs, terrorism, and human trafficking.
Yeah.
So that, don't you feel that, to me, kind of artificial intelligence didn't have negative coverage like that? So it had it on a science fiction level with Matrix and kind of Terminator, which is obviously to the extreme of what, you know, can potentially happen maybe. But in terms of, you know, media kind of scandals and things of that nature, there was this thing with a chatbot, right, on Twitter, that Microsoft released that started saying that started saying profanity. But then in general, if you could compare sort of the early days of AI emerging in media, you know, and hitting mainstream, and blockchain, since you've been kind of in both, how do they compare to each other?
I would agree with you. I think initially crypto had a lot of negative coverage, which I find fascinating in itself, because, you know, people would often say, oh, the problem with Bitcoin is that you can use it on the dark web, and people use it for illicit purposes such as buying guns or drugs, or, you know, the whole Silk Road debacle. But then you just stop and think, well, surely people use cash for exactly those purposes as well. So it's just, I think people were very quick to dismiss Bitcoin and just focus on its underlying technology. And I think at the time they didn't necessarily understand that, I mean, the industry has moved on massively since then, but that you needed a token for the ledger to exist in the first place. So definitely Bitcoin did get a lot of negative press. I also think that it was mostly due to people in mainstream media not necessarily understanding the technology. Partly because they weren't devoted to writing and reading about it every single day. AI, I think, has always had a bit of a positive spin, and it's only from my perspective, and obviously this is just my perception, so anyone's free to agree or disagree. I only really picked up on the fact that people were starting to talk about the ethics side of it probably when, I think it was Google that announced their ethics board, but wouldn't disclose who was part of it. And I seem to remember that happening sometime, I want to say last year or the year before that, but again, my memory fails me. I think what's interesting though is that people are very quick to badmouth the technology when it comes to like self-driving or driverless cars, and especially after the crash that happened earlier this year. But they don't necessarily stop and think that ultimately planes kind of pilot themselves, aside from, I think, it's takeoff and landing. So I think AI has always been more positive. I think it's starting to get a little bit more like negative stuff, especially when it comes to automation in jobs. But I think there's a lot of work in terms that needs to be done in terms of demystifying the tech, and also being far more open about, you know, what the positives and negatives are as well.
I'm sure you've well, I suspect you've written something about the crash, the Uber crash in Arizona. But I've read a bunch of your articles, by the way. They're amazing, but I haven't read anything about that really. So what was your, because to me, I wrote something about it too, and to me the coverage in the media of that accident was a bit strange in a way. They were kind of portraying the facts of that, right? What do you think, on a general note, how media handled the kind of first self-driving car crash?
So that's a difficult question for many different reasons, because I think journalism is an incredibly challenging industry, and increasingly so. But having said that, you know, obviously devastating that someone died. I don't think anyone was, you know, pleased about that. But then you also have to put into perspective that it got so much coverage because it was the first fatal accident, unfortunately. However, how many people die of in road traffic accidents due to human error? So I think all of that stuff will always make a big splash in the media because there's a news hook. And in this case was obviously the fact that it was the first fatal accident. I think Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer because um, I don't know whether it could have been done differently or covered differently, and if so,
Hmm.
how. But I think when stuff like that happens, you also need to open up debate and try and explain to people why it happened and what the consequences of it um, happening again would be and how to prevent those.
Hmm.
I mean, I often get asked, the question to me has always been like, oh, what happens if there's a self-driving car and ultimately the decision comes down to deciding whether you're going to run over a dog or like save yourself?
Yeah.
Or what happens when in a similar situation there's a pregnant lady crossing the road? What are the consequences and what are the implications for the technology to have that power of decision?
Hmm.
But then again, you're a human, you're driving a car, you see a dog, what are you going to do? Run over the dog or like spin the wheel and potentially crash into something and injure yourself?
Hmm.
It's just they're big questions, but I do genuinely think they need to be addressed and more so.
Hmm. I actually heard this theory. I'm not sure if you've heard it, and I'm not sure of the source, but I think I've read it either on Twitter or somewhere online that one of the solutions is to install an ethical switch that would kind of, so every driver has a right to predetermine how selfish or altruistic he or she wants to be, or I mean his car should be. Just what do you think about that solution? It seems a bit flawed, no?
Yeah, because who's to say that human judgment is also correct?
Yeah.
What do you think about it? I'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on it as well.
I mean, to me, it's kind of if everyone sets a different standard and kind of first, I think self-driving cars is amazing technology because eventually they will be able to kind of communicate to each other, right? So then they will be able sort of, how the planes, for example, if they go, there is one plane flying in the route of another plane and they would crash so that they actually kind of speak to one another and then they figure out which one's going to go up and which one's going to go down.
Yeah.
And there was this very famous airplane crash of a Soviet plane and an American one. And an American model says that eventually you have to listen to a computer, right, for a pilot. So that the computer makes the final decision on kind of those situations when there is another plane. Basically, when there is any emergency, you have to listen to the computer in the end. And then the Soviet system was saying that if there is an emergency, you have to consider the decision of a computer, but the pilot makes the final call. Right.
Okay.
And then there were two planes, one American, one Soviet. And then one decided, well, they ended up deciding, the planes and the tech inside decided that one is going to go up and then another one is going to go down. And then the collision would have been avoided.
Okay.
But then while the American one decided to go up, the Soviet pilot saw that the tech decided to go underneath the plane, but then he overruled the decision and also went up because he thought that the other one was going to go down because of the weather conditions.
Okay.
And then they ended up colliding. So that, to me, I think with those, also installing this kind of ethical switch can start to screw with the way self-driving cars kind of connect to each other because they have different parameters set. So to me, this is kind of difficult to figure out because I think this is where all the potential is, really. It's not necessarily about the skill of driving. It is about, a possibility of the cars communicating with each other that's going to really save a lot of lives.
Yeah. No, it makes total
But yeah,
sense.
I mean, it's difficult. Yeah, I'm not sure how is it going to work, and do you have to pay kind of tax? Then this takes you into a weird place of some very, very strange regulation. I
I
think.
think I'm just glad that I'm not the person that has to potentially try and answer all those questions.